Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, who has more than 2 decades of experience helping to facilitate the communication between organizational leaders and the various stakeholders. Michael commented earlier about a lot of the dysfunctional consequences of some of our contemporary scorekeeping around gross domestic product calculations and so on and so forth. Nick has been busily at work for years and years with counterparts in different parts of the world, working on alternative measures of organizational performance through his firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and many other organizations. And this morning in his discussion on practical sustainability, he's going to help us connect different dimensions of organizational performance with different stakeholders so that we can begin to think differently about the way organizations function. Colleges and universities have a new organization that's asking us to think differently. Corporations, the General Accountability Office, are facing a lot of stakeholders who want different scorekeeping, and needless to say, we've had enough sort of dysfunctional effects scattered across both the domestic and global economy that we all need to think differently about the way we account for one another's behavior and function. So without further ado, let us welcome from Hartford, Connecticut, Nick Shufro.
Well, after this morning's presentation by Michael, I think I'm going to bring it down quite a few levels in terms of really focusing on what companies are doing and how people are communicating. So a little less visionary, but a little bit more to what's been happening in the United States, across the globe with companies, and what you can do at your organizations. So So to start off, I have a couple of questions that, just a quick show of hands. So how many of your organizations or organizations that you work with are looking to reduce packaging transportation costs? Just a show of hands. Okay, so 20%, let's say 10-20% in the audience. And I guess the first myth is that it's not just sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, and we'll define it in a few minutes, is not only applicable to very large organizations. Second question is how many of your organizations are looking to retain employees or hire new employees? Just a show of hands. Okay, so even in today's economy, we found at PwC, at PricewaterhouseCoopers, that one of the most frequently asked question as we're interviewing people that they ask us is to talk about our sustainability program and our carbon footprint. And we're an accounting firm, and so you'd think absolutely no relevance, but it's the most frequently asked question. How many of you have heard of the GE Eco-Imagination program? Okay. GE came out a couple of years ago and decided that they looked at all of their existing businesses and said, sustainability can be good for us. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means for GE in a few minutes. How many of you, we just heard Michael's going to go catch a conference call at 1. How many of you use teleconferencing or video conferencing as a way to sort of cut down on travel and needing to get on airplanes? Okay. So there's obviously an opportunity by using technology right now to reduce your emissions. And then the last question, how many of you have bought some Energy Star equipment in the last year or two? Okay, so it's already, sustainability, energy efficiency is already in your lives, and you may not be aware of it. So I'm going to go through a couple of sessions, sort of share the context, talk about what's been happening. And if you think about some of the charts that Michael showed a few minutes ago where the scope of change is changing, the scope of change in the United States with regulations and activities is just moving very, very quickly. When we started talking in January and we put together the outline for today's presentation, it was very different, and half of what is in here wouldn't have been included in the outline in January. So it's very much changing. Talk a little bit about a couple of corporate initiatives and what's happening, and then also talk about what you can do, and then some quick final thoughts. So in terms of context, I wanted to define sustainability and then also talk about what's happening in terms of it's not necessarily just the green organizations, but as we said before, it's very much being mainstreamed. And then most of the presentation will actually talk about climate change because that's what we're finding our companies and our clients are most interested in. So in terms of sustainability, there are a number of different terms that we see, ranging from corporate citizenship to triple bottom line. There's some alliterative ones like economics, equity, and the environment. We also see people, planet, and profit. And what we have heard is that we talked a little bit about, Michael talked about the Brundtland Commission definition for sustainability. Basically, the layman's terms definition is that you're doing things now that are not going to have an impact on your children. And so all of these terms are umbrella terms. There's a lot that goes under these terms, and sustainability has a bunch of different names. We look at sustainability from the people, planet, and profit perspective. And so the focus of today is really on planet, because we'll be talking a lot about climate change, but we're looking, when people talk about the triple bottom line, they talk about people, planet, and profit, and these are sort of the ideas that come into it. I'll let you take a minute just to look at that. Okay, so the first concept is that sustainability is very, very complex, and it's an umbrella term that can be used and should be adapted to different sectors and different companies, depending on what they really think about. So the retail and consumer products companies that are involved with the Grocery Manufacturers Association came together a couple of years ago and came up with a list of topics that they think are included in sustainability. And some of these you wouldn't necessarily think about in terms of product safety, biodiversity, resource use. These are really, it is an umbrella term. And so when we talk to clients and want to find out what are they interested in, one of the first things we need to do is really come to some kind of agreement as to what's in sustainability and what's not, because you really can't boil the ocean. You can't do everything all at once. And so you really need to figure out what's most important and relevant to your organization. The companies, and this is, I'm sorry that it's really too small to see, but the important thing here is these are the companies that actually attended a session at the Sustainability Summit for the Grocery Manufacturers Association a couple of years ago. And there are some pretty big names here from Coca-Cola Company, Dow Chemical, Kellogg's, a lot of S&P 500 companies, a lot of not-for-profits, a lot of government agencies. And what's impressive about this list, which you'll be able to see when you download it from the website, should you want to do it, is that it's really, really a lot of mainstream organizations that are looking at this issue and that are coming up with strategies that are most appropriate to their particular organizations and trying to figure out what they can do, what's the most important impact of their organization, and what they should be doing going forward. I'll give you two quick examples, sort of talking about mainstreaming. Walmart has come out with a program a couple of years ago, and they determined that compact fluorescent light bulbs was a real good way to engage their customers. Maybe not the biggest impact, but they set a target saying we're going to sell about 100 million compact fluorescent light bulbs over a period of time in 2007. And this is a way where we can actually engage with customers, get them to think about their impact, their individual impacts, and then actually get them to buy greener. And some interesting facts about that. Very quickly, Walmart went through their actual target of 100 million compact fluorescent light bulbs. They sold 137 million in 2007. And so clearly they had picked on something, and whether it was Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, or just a lot of awareness, people were out buying compact fluorescent light bulbs. The impact on this was that it was no longer just large corporations. It was really people getting to do what they wanted, wanted to show that they wanted to do something themselves. And as an impact, it was individual consumers making decisions, voting with their money, going out and buying the light bulbs themselves. In terms of actual impact, Walmart was very clear in talking about a single compact fluorescent light bulb can save about 450 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of its use. And that equates to about 110 pounds of coal not being burned. So if you think about Michael's presentation earlier about the impact of coal, every time you go out and you buy a compact fluorescent light bulb and you actually install it, you're having an impact of reducing 110 pounds worth of coal being burned and the emissions associated with that. In terms of savings, we heard a little bit about energy use at homes, and about 20% of lighting, about 20% of home energy use, according to Walmart, is lighting. And so think about how much you spend on your utility bill that you don't see because you only get it a month after you've used the energy. If you could reduce your emissions and your costs and save 20% of your costs over a period of time, that's probably a good thing. The amount of money that's saved from using compact fluorescent bulbs, and this is once again another Walmart number. They talked about the 5 states and they actually tracked the buying patterns of the 137 million compact fluorescent light bulbs that were sold, and the savings to a state like Texas were approximately $340 million in savings. In Colorado, which was way down the list, they estimated that the people who bought compact fluorescent light bulbs in Colorado saved the state, or saved themselves, about $58 million worth of money. So the numbers can be fairly huge in terms of the impact, both on a dollar basis and also on emissions basis. General Electric, another case study, went out and said, we're going to do something around our programs. We're going to basically rebrand what we're already doing. So we sell turbines, we sell jet engines, we sell trains, and yet we're going to go out and we're going to sell and we're going to promote our more fuel-efficient train. It's countries are going to buy trains to run Amtrak or to do rail freight, etc. But we're going to go out, we're going to design a more efficient engine, and then we're going to go out and sell it. And GE, which had a previous history of not necessarily being a good corporate citizen, mostly because of the problems that they had in New York with PCB disposal in rivers, etc., basically went out and said, eco-imagination is so important to us and is such a revenue driver that we're going to go out and we're actually going to rebrand a lot of our products. We're going to change our position on the environment, which they've done. And the numbers are pretty staggering. They estimate that their product revenues increased from about $12 billion in 2006 to $14 billion. And they think about 23% of GE's revenues are related to their eco-imagination program. So a fairly significant amount. And they've also set some intensity goals internally, and they have reduced emissions pretty considerably through their programs, the greenhouse gas emissions, which I'll talk about in a few more minutes. So interesting that sustainability is one, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what you would include in it. And number two, large organizations are really having a look at this to say there's actually profitability from this. Walmart has made a couple, just going back to Walmart, and the reason we're not picking on Walmart, Walmart is a very good example of where they had problems in the past and then decided they looked at things, and the CEO at the time, Lee Scott, talks about the impact of Hurricane Katrina and Walmart's outreach efforts and how that basically changed his mind and changed the thinking of Walmart. But Walmart came out with about 7 sustainable value networks on their product side, And they decided that they have a lot of products in their stores, and once again, they can't do everything all at once, so they figured they would start off with 7 product and about 5 direct footprint areas. And they pulled together something called a Sustainable Value Network, where they brought in a bunch of stakeholders, including their suppliers, their users, their regulatory authorities, their own logistics folks, and they said, maybe not as transformative as what Michael had talked about, but they said, let's look at these particular products and figure out if we can make less packaging, we can reduce the amount of water that's used in, let's say, laundry cleaning supplies, and let's see if we can have a better impact. They also, at the same time, set some goals, which were, if you think about Walmart's size, they really decided that they were going to try and reduce emissions, reduce waste, and make their products a little more useful. And they are on their way on a journey to reduce emissions. And I flew back from Walmart a couple of weeks ago, sat down next to a guy who actually runs their logistics programs and their trucking and logistics programs, maybe at this summit next week. And he talked about how they were able to save a gallon of gas per truck. So basically, they're increasing their fuel efficiency of their trucks and the bottom line impact that's having on Walmart because of the extensive fleets that they have. Saving hundreds of $millions over periods of time, basically by putting in auxiliary power units, putting in windshields around their trucks so that it's a more aerodynamic flow, also looking at the products that they're shipping, so working with their suppliers and saying we don't want a laundry detergent that's water-based, we'd like a more super concentrated product, and it's a drier version, which means that we're not moving water around. Maybe not the example of the Fiji water, but we're not moving water around, and so we're decreasing the amount of energy needed to get product from suppliers to the consumers. So we're going to talk a little bit about climate change, and a couple of reasons for why I wanted to talk about climate change as opposed to sustainability. As I had mentioned, sustainability is a broad umbrella term. It's harder for people to sort of get their arms around. Climate change, really, when you think about energy use and your impact, it's a lot easier for people to understand what is the impact of their particular activities. In addition, the scope of change in the United States and across the globe has really picked up, and a lot of companies are looking at climate change as their lead loss, if you like. This is the first area that they are considering, and they may have other programs like waste or other related sustainability programs, but they're really focusing right now on energy use and reducing emissions. Practical impacts, if we heard a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions and the impact of water, scarcity and availability. There is some link that people will talk about in terms of hurricanes, the increasing intensity of hurricanes being linked to climate change. As an accounting firm, we're very clear that we're agnostic on the science of climate change. So I won't sit here and say, temperatures are going up 1 degree or down 1 degree. We don't actually get involved in the science of climate change. We won't sit there and say that the sea levels are rising or hurricanes are increasing in intensity. But these are some of the comments that are made in general by people. And so perceptions in our mind are very important. You've got 2 drivers for companies. 1 are regulations, and then 2, you've got also perceptions, and whether those are voluntary perceptions or actual consumer perceptions, those are very important. This is a chart that was put together by Swiss Re that they talk about, and I know that I said I wasn't going to talk about the impacts of hurricanes and droughts, etc. But it's interesting to note that this is the amount of money that organizations like a Swiss Re are paying over time and have paid as payouts for natural disasters and weather-related disasters. And the light blue line are man-made disasters, and I don't know if you can see it in the back of the room, but what's interesting is that the attacks on the World Trade Center and all of the dislocation and all the impacts on 9/11 are very, very small compared to Hurricanes Ike and Gustav. How many people even know when Hurricanes Ike and Gustav took place versus Hurricane Katrina that everybody talks about? And yet the impact of Hurricanes Ike and Gustav combined are much more significant from a financial perspective than the impacts of 9/11. PricewaterhouseCoopers does an annual survey to CEOs. It's done every January. The results are announced. And this is the survey result from about 2 years ago. And at the time, what was interesting was that this was sort of all before, it's basically a 6-month lag. So what was presented in January 2 years ago was actually June, July of the previous year. And at the time, their CEOs were most concerned about rising energy costs. And at the time, what was interesting was that climate change was actually just hitting the top of the radar screen. Not the top issue, but about the 6th or 7th issue at the time, and was of interest to CEOs and of concern to them. And that's, if you were to look at the key, about 7% of CEOs at the time were extremely concerned, and 20% were somewhat concerned about climate change and weather patterns and rising threats. If you fast forward to last year, and you look at what some of the results are, and here climate change was actually one of the issues that was queried in particular by these CEOs. And a lot of the CEOs basically who had said, well, climate change is somewhat of an issue or somewhat of a concern, a year later, a number of these CEOs were talking about, not only is it important to us, but we also think that governments should be doing things, we should be doing things. And so this slide is a slightly different picture, but it talks to what the CEOs thought should be done and how they should be addressing climate change and who should be involved in actually working through addressing the issues of climate change. So what's been happening? I mentioned that there were, things have picked up in pace and scale. And so looking at global trends, you can't read the colors, but what's significant is, and we heard this before, the amount of emissions that are projected by 2030 are pretty high. And we're seeing that if you were to look at the colors, the lowest bar, the sort of purplish, are the U.S. The reddish bar, the second one, is other OECD countries. The yellow bar, which is the third one, are Chinese emissions. And then the top bar, which you really can't see, are the other non-OECD countries. And so what you're seeing here is that the projected emissions from China and the other non-OECD countries is very significant. And we've heard about rising standards of living and expectations in a lot of countries across the globe. What's significant about this chart is that by 2030, if projections are correct, even if the U.S. were to significantly, the U.S. and other OECD countries were to significantly cut their emissions, and we don't engage with other developing countries, we're not going to do anything that's really substantive. We're going to continue to have problems because of the scope of emissions that are expected from other developing countries. Okay. This chart it's actually 4 different line items, and it's a timeline from about 1992 up through 2009. The top one shows, if all the way in the upper left, in 1992 was the Rio Earth Summit, and that was the first real big event around climate change. I mean, there had been other things, but that was really the one that garnered a lot of public attention. Over time, the second line, which you can barely see, is the Kyoto Protocol came out in 1997. And then there were a series of what are called conferences of parties. And if you were looking at the top line in 2007, there was a Bali roadmap, which was a meeting about a year and a half ago, where people came up and said, we are going to come to some kind of global initiative to replace Kyoto, which is expiring in 2012, and we're going to set up a roadmap which is supposed to culminate this year in some Copenhagen meetings in December. And it's basically a roadmap to replace the Kyoto Protocol, which is expiring, and actually then figure out what the world should be doing in terms of moving forward. The thought is that it will be not only engaging the developing countries, but also the hope is that we'll be able to engage some developing countries. In the European Union emissions trading scheme came out in 2005, and that's the phase one. It was not quite a success because the emissions, there's a little bit of, it's a cap and trade system, which means that companies are allocated a certain amount of emissions, and then they're actually allowed to trade with other companies if it's more cost efficient for them to reduce emissions that way. And the EU ETS came out with a lot of promise, and they over allocated the emissions, so it wasn't quite successful. In other words, they gave out more credits than were really needed, and a lot of companies didn't have to make the hard changes that Michael was talking about before, because the credits were there, they were cheap, the markets really crashed, and so the Europeans are still dealing with the EU ETS. They're now in phase two, which is including more companies and industries. And phase three, which is the aviation EU ETS, is in the planning stage. And what we're starting to see is, again, more industries getting engaged in this discussion. So from now on, if you fly into the European Union starting in later this year, United Airlines, American Airlines, Delta, all of the U.S. carriers are now being pulled into the European Union emissions trading scheme because they're now looking to say, okay, what are the plans that you have to become more fuel efficient, to participate in the markets, etc. And so it's not just the European Union. If you look at the UK has been a real leader over the last couple of years, and there are a number of different things, including the UK emissions trading scheme, which was set up a couple of years ago. This year they have a climate change bill and a carbon reduction commitment. So they're actually, the UK has set binding targets on the UK in terms of getting companies engaged, industries engaged, and saying this is what we're going to do. And it's the real first real example of a binding program set up by an individual country. And that took place this year. And then the carbon reduction commitment is additional work that companies are going to be expected to do going forward. So let's talk about the U.S. for a minute. In the 1990s, we did not participate in, we actually attended Kyoto, we signed the agreement, but we didn't endorse it. So we were there in 1992, but then when it actually came out, actually it was 1997, when it came out and the Kyoto came into force because enough nations had signed it, the United States was not one of the countries that participated, and so it was not binding on us. And at the time, we said that we were not going to participate because, amongst a number of different reasons, there weren't targets and objectives that were binding on countries, developing countries. We had a number of voluntary programs in the United States, climate leaders. The Department of Energy had a voluntary filing system called the 1605B filing system, where companies could talk about what their emissions are and try and keep track of them, with the idea that when we got to a point where we had programs in place, they could get credit for any early actions that they had taken. But things really didn't pick up until about 2006 in the United States. And in 2006, we had California pass the AB 32, which was the first state law. And then we had a bunch of regional initiatives with the Western Governors Association pulling together a commitment in 2006. We also had the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. I'll talk about some of these. We had a bunch of companies come together under the U.S. cap. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And now in 2009, we have our first cap and trade system that started on January 1st of this year for utilities in the Northeast. So we have a binding program for about 10 states and 2 Canadian provinces, which actually started in January. The stimulus package, I'll talk a little bit about that. That had a lot of green and renewable energy efficiency programs in it. And March 10th, there was the release of a proposed greenhouse gas rule. And a couple of weeks ago, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners started calling for insurance companies to actually report on the risk associated with climate change and their insured. And so that actually kicked in too. So point here is that very little on the left side, and over time there's just been a lot of activity going on. Well, this, if you were to see the map of the world, you would be able to see that there are a number of proposed carbon markets and trading schemes that are taking place. I mentioned in Europe, we're now in the 3rd phase under proposal for the emissions union trading scheme. In Japan, Japan is looking at its own cap and trade system. Australia and New Zealand have been very, very vocal and are working very hard on trading schemes. And in the U.S., there are a bunch of state and regional programs that had been in process. And then about 3 weeks ago, we actually had a proposed U.S. system come into a proposed rule on reporting. And then last week, we actually had a bill that I'll talk about in a few minutes that made its way. Representative Waxman introduced a bill last week. So finishing up the global trends, I mentioned before the Bali Action Plan, which was about 1.5 years ago, basically said we need to work together. We need to replace the Kyoto Protocol, which is expiring in 2012. We need to figure out what's going to be after Kyoto. There's a lot of emphasis on technology and adaptation. And then also, if the developed world wants to engage the developing world, there have to be some mechanisms to help fund the transfer of technology and information so that the developing world can actually implement some of the things that we're proposing. So in the U.S., what's interesting here is that while there hasn't been a federal policy for the last couple of years, and there has been a lot of activity. And going through the different states, there were about 25 states that actually had set targets themselves. So this is in a situation where the federal government is not really stepping in. There had been about 25 states actually doing things. And as an example, in Colorado, they were looking at a 20% below 2005 levels by 2020 goal. Varied targets for different states, some a little more aggressive than others. But interesting to see that states had set actual targets. In addition, about 38 states had set renewable portfolio standards. So in the state of Connecticut, where I'm from, we had the electricity deregulation about 5 or 6 years ago, and as part of the deregulation bill, there was something called a renewable portfolio standard, which basically said, over time, we're going to expect that the utilities in the state generate or buy clean energy from renewables, and it's going to be an increasing amount over time. So we're looking at hydro, we're looking at solar, we're looking at wind, Connecticut is the fuel cell state, so fuel cells was also included in. And we're looking at an increasing percentage of our total portfolio should be from renewables. So about 38 states had done that. There were a number of other things that were going on, and a lot of the philosophy was that states were really the laboratories where a lot of these policies could be tried out. So the amount of state initiatives was pretty amazing, the variety of programs that were in place, And a lot of the lessons learned from the state initiatives were then drawn into the regional initiatives, and hopefully we will avoid mistakes at the federal level by drawing upon some of the lessons that have come in from the states and the regional initiatives. Nonetheless, we do have a problem where we are increasing, we had been increasing our overall emissions, and there are a variety of different sources: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then a couple of the other gases. What's interesting to see from this slide is that our overall numbers are still increasing, as we've said, except for about a year ago when there was a reduction, a start of a trend. And we anticipate that emissions this year will be down principally because business activity is down quite a bit and because people are much more aware of what's going on. So conferences, my organization, we have a lot of annual trainings. We bring down 4,000 people down to Florida, for instance, for a week of training. Because of the economy, we've decided not to do that. So the emissions associated with bringing 4,000 people down to Florida is not going to happen. The challenge is we can't take credit for the economy in terms of the environmental reduced emissions because at some point things will reverse themselves and we will have that conference down in Florida. So we need to figure out, maybe we shouldn't be having the conference in Florida, maybe we should be doing it electronically via video conferencing, or maybe we should have 4 separate conferences. How do we do this smarter in the future and not necessarily just take credit for a slower economy? Over the last couple of years, there have also been a couple of bills that have made their way through. This shows the projected impact on emissions over time of the different bills that were in place. And the bill that was the front runner and which actually made it to a debate, or tried to make it to a debate, was the Warner-Lieberman bill, which is sort of the purple one, and it shows sort of a stepped decrease of emissions over time. I won't go through the different bills that are out there or that were out there, but this is a historical, this is what was happening in the past, and in a few minutes we'll talk about the Waxman bill. So even though there wasn't a federal program in place, there were a number of bills that were raised over the last couple of years with the intent of actually addressing emissions. I mentioned earlier the Bush administration did pull back from Kyoto, and the principal reason was, the 2 principal reasons were, one, the concern that developing countries weren't handed binding targets, and then the second was the concern that adopting the Kyoto Protocol and implementing it would have resulted in serious harm to the U.S. economy. This was the thinking of a couple of years ago, and this was interesting, especially as the Stern report came out, and the Sir Nicholas Stern, an economist in the United Kingdom, came out and basically said the cost of acting now to address climate change and carbon emissions is much lower now than it will be in the future, and if you don't start to act, if countries in the globe don't start to act, we're going to start having problems. We did have some back and forth between California had always been pushing a little harder in terms of automotive standards, and there was also some back and forth between US EPA and the Bush administration in terms of whether or not carbon emissions were and greenhouse gases were things that had to be regulated under the US EPA. And basically there was a little bit back and forth, and in December of 2007 the US Supreme Court said, yeah, EPA, you've got to regulate CO2 emissions. And President Bush said, let's try and pull together some large economies and have some discussions and basically come out with a new framework, and let's try and get this done by the end of 2008 with the idea that we can actually start addressing this, and let's not necessarily go through the Kyoto Protocol and those mechanisms. So a lot of activity. The pulling together the countries in 2008 did not happen, and so President Bush left, and now we have a new situation where the Obama campaign, the Obama administration, as one of its big initiatives, talked about wanting to put into place a cap and trade system. And this was one of their platforms, and the Obama administration came in with a very strong emphasis on addressing greenhouse gases. This has probably taken a lot more energy over the last couple of months as the economy's faltered, and people have realized that if a cap and trade system were set up, there are potential revenues that would come from actually setting up a cap and trade system. And so people don't realize it, but about 11% of the stimulus package is related to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And a couple of things, just very high level in terms of the stimulus package. There had been a little bit of uncertainty every year. If you wanted to implement a solar PV panel and photovoltaic panel at one of your office buildings or one of your locations, the way the previous incentives had been set up, basically January you would have started to plan, and you could have implemented, and this is one of the barriers that Michael referred to before, you could have implemented the program, but you basically had to have the solar PVs in place by around November of the year in order for you to get the tax credits for it. And every year there was sort of this, is Congress going to renew the tax credits or not? Are we, what's going to happen? And if you don't have your installations in place by November or December, are you not going to be able to take advantage of the tax credits? So every year there was sort of this November debate, and then the tax credits were renewed. Well, for planning purposes, it's very challenging to actually look at that and figure out whether or not you can expect the stream, the reduced stream from taxes, and whether you can put that into your calculations as to whether or not the projects are profitable if you know that in November you've got to get everything in place. Under the new stimulus package, one of the very small tweaks that's happened is that if you start planning now, you have until about 2014, and it actually depends on what types of projects you're putting in. Wind, solar, all have different years, but you can basically, you have a much longer planning horizon. You can go out to 2016 with some types of energy, and that gives you a little more certainty to know that you're going to have some tax incentives. So we're talking to a lot of clients right now who say, we've got a huge campus, we've got a huge building, and we know that we actually, if we plan now and we take the time to design properly and we put in wind turbines or we put in solar photovoltaics, solar panels, we'll actually have the opportunity to do it and to get some income streams with the tax incentives, and it's a great thing. So we're actually going to be able to do it as opposed to sort of the stop and go that had happened in the past. In addition, this year under the stimulus package, and not many companies know this, but if you're in a net operating loss position, so you didn't make money, you just didn't do that well last year, the stimulus package is set up so that you may not pay taxes this year, but basically you can walk into Treasury and say, we've installed these solar panels, this is the cost, we're in a net operating loss position this year, and Treasury will actually write you a check that you would actually be equivalent to what you would have gotten had you been paying taxes, had you been in a positive cash position. So that's another thing that's really enticed a lot of companies, and unfortunately a lot of companies are in a net operating loss environment, but it's good for the environment that at least they can actually implement these programs where if this particular clause was not in the bill, wouldn't have happened. So the stimulus package does look at a bunch of renewable energies, including wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, municipal solid waste, marine and hydrokinetic resources. So tidal resources. This is a laundry list that you'll be able to see, and basically of the $787 billion stimulus package, about $61 billion, and this is not even the complete picture, is related to energy. And this is a combination, to Michael's point before, this is energy efficiency and renewable energy. So targeted across different sectors. And this slide, of all the slides, if you actually download it, this is, I think, the most interesting slide because it talks about where the U.S. government hopes to go in the future, and what types of technologies may be available, from training of green-collar workers, electric vehicle technologies, weatherization of modest income homes. There are a whole slew of activities that are being funded under the stimulus package that are going to have an impact on energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So now let's talk about regulations. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on March 30th that a proposed draft greenhouse mandatory reporting rule came out. And one of the problems that happened in the European Union when they launched the emissions trading scheme was that they basically said, okay, here is the allocation. So if you're this company or this industry, you get this level of permits, and we're going to set up a cap and trade system. And they didn't do their homework beforehand. And they didn't figure out how many emissions and how much energy and how really was needed to make it an effective program. And what they ended up doing was having an oversupply of credits. And for anybody who's taken any basic Econ 101, if the supply of credits was more than the demand for credits, the price came crashing down. And that's what happened in the European Union. So this proposed rule that came out on March 10th, and which will be posted in the Federal Register and open for a 60-day comment period, basically looks at a bunch of industries and says, before we go out and set up any type of program, we basically want to find out what emissions are. And then once we have the numbers in, and we're going to set a threshold for reporting companies, once we have, and sectors, once we have the information in, then we're going to be able to make an informed decision and allocate the credits appropriately so that the credits actually have some value. And from an accounting perspective, what we like to talk about is you're seeing monetization of credits and monetization of carbon. So carbon emissions, which were a pollution, now companies and countries are starting to look at what's the price associated with these, and what does this mean in terms of they're creating value, companies can trade them back and forth. If I am in a situation where I need to comply with a regulation and reduce my emissions, and I can't do it myself, I can go out and buy it from another organization. And so this is really the beginning of what's going to happen in the United States over the next couple of years. This is leading into an informed discussion. They're estimating that about 13,000 facilities in the United States are going to be impacted by the rule, and that's about 85 to 90% of the emissions that are generated. And they're basically doing it at the facility level. So if you have a factory and your emissions are above 25,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year, you're going to have to report. And it's coming in under the Clean Air Act, and like any other regulated air pollutant, it's going to actually be required at the facility level. The thought is that there will be, and there has been, some introduction of a cap and trade system, and that's in the bill that was announced last week. But once again, after this is all implemented, we'll have an idea of what types of emissions are coming from which companies across the different sectors. And here are some of the different sectors that are targeted: power plants, electricity generation, transportation, vehicle and engine manufacturers. So we have a lot of, as an example, we have a lot of clients in Korea who import cars to the United States. And we're getting a lot of calls from them saying, okay, if you add up our entire fleet that we bring into the United States, we're actually covered by this. So what's the process for going out and estimating what the emissions are, because we will be subject to this reporting threshold even though we're in Korea. And we're having a lot of discussions now with organizations around the world on similar topics. Metals, iron and steel manufacturing, aluminum, zinc, lead, minerals, cement, pulp and paper, chemicals, oil and gas, other landfill, wastewater treatment systems, agriculture, and I wanted to sort of spend a minute. Agriculture is actually manure management, depending on the size of your feedlots, are actually going to be implementing the greenhouse gas reporting rule. So, and what the regulation, which is about 650 pages long, basically takes the 30 or so different sectors and says, here's what's in, here's what's out, here's the way you calculate, here's some of the requirements. So understanding that there may be some interest, I took a quick look here, And if you are a facility, an agricultural facility, and you have you generate in excess of 25,000 metric tons of CO2 per year, you're going to be actually required to report under this greenhouse gas reporting rule. And it talks about, how you go about calculating and doing the requirements for who can actually go out and do the measurements and how you would do it. And it gets very granular in terms of looking at it. You can't see this, but they actually take different animal livestock and they actually make estimates of how much manure comes out from an animal over a period of a year. And this is what's going to be happening across a bunch of different sectors. And so it's interesting to figure out that this is really going to have an impact on the U.S. economy in terms of reporting because it's going to get down to a very granular level. I mentioned there's the American Clean Energy and Security Act, which came out on March 31st. And basically, this is a proposed cap-and-trade system. And it's going to take the information from the reporting rule that came out, and it's looking to establish some economy-wide cap-and-trade systems. And basically, the target is to get down 83% of emissions by 2050. So it's fairly aggressive, and using a variety of tools and instruments to reduce emissions. There's some thought of performance standards and vehicle standards and a whole slew of different things that will happen over time. Okay, so that's the federal level, and I know that this is, it's some of this is interesting, but what I'm trying to do is sort of paint a picture of here's what's been happening at the global level. It's U.S. federal now, a couple of regional initiatives, and then it's getting to be much more tangible. And things are actually happening. It was a couple of years ago that this was all sort of pie in the sky and a bunch of green folks talking about it. Now it's much more mainstreamed. Large organizations are talking about it, and it's actually reaching down into the economy and could have an impact on your businesses or organizations. So this is a map of some regional initiatives that are in place. The first one on the upper right is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And I mentioned RGGI came into force in January of this year. It's about 10 states in the Northeast and a couple of Canadian provinces. The two others that are really large are the Western Climate Initiative, and obviously Colorado is involved in that, and the Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Accord, which is, actually it has a different name. This was the initial name of it. So just a couple of things on this. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative came into place. Its cap-and-trade system just targets utilities. So if you're in another sector, it doesn't really impact you. It's got some fairly aggressive targets. And it came out with a model rule so that for the first time, if you were in New Hampshire, you had the same thought perspective as Vermont did, or New Jersey, or Connecticut. So what are the rules of the game so that if you do something in one state, it's actually equal to what would be happening in another state that's in this compact? And really focusing on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and then other clean energy technologies. Couple of auctions have taken place, and talking about the pricing of credits. The first auction was on September 28th, and it was about $3 a ton of carbon emissions. And there have been four auctions in total, and the prices have remained around pretty constant: $307, $338, $351, and $305, depending on the time frame. So the last two were about 3 weeks ago, and the $3.51 per ton was for 2009 versus $3.05 for 2012. What's important here is that you're seeing stability in a regional initiative, a regional cap-and-trade system, and so you're not seeing what happened in Europe where there was came in at this price and crashed very quickly. There is stability, which creates more certainty for organizations, and it makes it easier for people to plan. The Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Reduction Accord was signed by 9 Midwestern states and 2 Canadian provinces, and they actually moved over, and it became oops. And here it's a much broader program. It's just not just utilities. And there were a number of things that were building upon the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where they took some of the lessons learned and said, we're going to actually improve upon the system. Moving on, the Western Governors Association came out in June of 2006 and said that they wanted to put together something called the Western Climate Initiative. And the Western Climate Initiative, as you can see, includes Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And if you look at the territories that are covered that are either in blue or green, right, it's a fairly large landmass that we're talking about. And it's probably the largest of all of the regional initiatives based on the size of the states. Also of interest is that there were a number of Mexican states that participated for the first time. And here you've got a long-term commitment, and it's multi-sector, so it's not just the utilities, but it's pretty broad-based. And they're looking at electricity generation, industrial and commercial fuel, fossil fuel combustion, industrial process emissions, gas and diesel consumption for transportation, and they're even reaching down to residential fuel use, so it's your home. And you're not going to, if an individual homeowner is not going to have to actually report in on what your greenhouse gas emissions are, what's going to happen is the power plant that sells you the energy, the electricity, will actually have to report on your behalf. They have a pretty aggressive work plan. And going through this, I mean, there's a lot of detail here which you can download, but basically it's not just, okay, we're going to set up a cap and trade system, but we're going to actually have systems in place for verification of the information. So you say you have this amount of energy and you've cut it by this and the according amount of greenhouse gas emissions. There's actually requirements that people who go out and kick the tires around the numbers on what you're claiming are accredited, and there's modeling guidance, there's comparability across all of the different states, also comparability across the different regional initiatives. So what you're seeing here, I mentioned before, things started at the state level in terms of laboratories and sort of kicking out the policies. There have been some regional initiatives where they've taken the lessons learned and incorporated it. And now what you're seeing is the building of consensus, which may help the U.S. across all of the states and all of the regions come up with different regulations over time that we can actually implement. Okay, so just switching gears just very quickly for corporate and voluntary initiatives. This is where I focus a lot of my time. Climate Action, U.S. CAP, was a group of companies. You can't see the logos there, but about 30 companies, and companies that you might not necessarily think would be coming out for a cap and trade system and for U.S. federal regulations. And as an example, Duke Energy. 4 or 5 years ago, you'd sort of assume never would be involved in any initiative to put in cap and trade or greenhouse gas reporting requirements. And Duke Energy basically came out and said, look, you know, if we don't have one unified national program, we're going to deal with 50 different states or a whole bunch of different regional initiatives. It's going to be much more difficult. We think the U.S. government should take some leadership and actually start to lead the pack in terms of coming up with regulations and think about what we should be doing. So they called for some pretty aggressive targets, 20% of 2005 levels by 2050, which is pretty aggressive when you think that we're going to cut 80% of our emissions. They're looking for a federal cap and trade program, and they're also saying that what we do in the United States really has to be integrated with what's happening in the world, and the U.S. really should come to the table. We can't do what we did post-Kyoto and not show up. We really need to engage. Another initiative that's taking place is called the, and here's where a company that wants to report gets involved. For the last couple of years, it's been voluntary reporting. Companies have reported on their greenhouse gas emissions because they've either had shareholder resolutions or because they thought it was the right thing to do or because they were looking to reduce energy emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and they wanted to sort of measure it. In 2004, Actually, in 1999 came out the first version. 2004, the second version came out of something called the WRI GHG protocol. It was actually put together by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. And here it was a global project to basically come up with the accounting around carbon emissions. So how do you decide what's in, what you have to count? If you're a professional services firm, what do you include in your carbon footprint? If you're a dairy owner, what do you have to include? If you're a heavy, an energy-intensive or carbon-intensive industry, what do you actually need to put in? And they're very easy to read in terms of written for non-accountants, non-environmentalists. So, you know, common sense. If you've got operational control, financial control over an organization, what kinds of emissions should you be counting? And what's interesting, I'll talk in a minute about the Carbon Disclosure Project, but we did a survey, and I brought some copies from last year. We did a survey of the S&P 500. And of the S&P 500 companies that were approached, 321 completed the survey. 281 companies, when they were asked, what is your document that you use, what's your base foundational document, turned and said the GHG protocol is what we use. And this is from companies that 5 years ago, 2 years ago weren't reporting, but about 77% of the companies that were asked actually used the greenhouse gas protocol. There are some additional documents under development. I'm not going to go into the details around Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, but basically there's more definition being provided to companies to make sure that they understand what they should be accounting. So you, as an investor, can go in and say, this company is reporting, 1,000 tons. This company is reporting 2,000 tons. Why is there a difference? What are they including? What are they not? And what's happening is that it used to be that the mandatory, under the GHG protocol, what was mandatory for a company that wanted to report under this voluntary program was they had to talk about their own operations. And there were two different scopes. And now we're looking at suppliers, and we're also looking at customers. So we're looking at the emissions that if you manufacture not an air conditioner but a refrigerator, for example, and you're subject to reporting under the reporting rule, the GHG reporting rule, and you design a refrigerator that's very efficient, there's some discussion about actually saying, okay, you design the refrigerator in a very efficient manner, but you got a 6-year-old who keeps on opening and closing the refrigerator door, and how effective is the design when you actually use it? What things can you do to reduce emissions? And you have to actually report on those types of emissions too. I don't think that's going to fly, but that was something that was proposed. Carbon Disclosure Project I mentioned. I did bring some reports. This is a voluntary initiative. A not-for-profit started asking companies a couple of years ago to report on their CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. The initial CDP1 had a very low turnout. About 46% of the companies of the Global 500 companies actually responded. Now it's about 77% of the companies in the Global 500 respond every year to this survey. In the U.S., we started an S&P 500 one about 3 years ago, and we're now at 64% of the S&P 500 companies are responding to this voluntary information request, and we're expecting it's going to be 75 to 80% this year in terms of number of companies who are actually reporting in on this. In all transparency, we write the reports, so PwC, so that's why we know a lot about this. And basically, the report looks at risks and opportunities from climate change. What are companies saying are the risks and opportunities? What is the accounting that they use for greenhouse gas emissions? What is the company's strategy to reduce emissions? What types of targets and goals have they set? And then finally, what kind of governance section do they have? Here are some of the reports, and you can't see here, you can see it on my screen, but what this is intending to show is a bunch of concentric circles where of the S&P 500, 321 answered the response. Of those, a certain number of companies elected to make the information public. And this is the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's actually, what information are you making available public? So it's a smaller circle. There are about 70 companies that submitted the information but did not want it to be made public. Of that, there are companies that set targets. There are companies that have, programs in place. And it gets smaller and smaller to the point where when you're talking about a specific type of emissions under this Scope 3 emissions, of the 321 companies, only 8 companies could talk about their supply chain. So we're not talking about a lot of disclosure right now. In one area, we're seeing a lot of companies talk about their business travel, for instance, and they can calculate what the emissions are from people flying in airplanes and driving cars, etc., but very few of them can talk about their emissions in their supply chain. And if you think about the fact that Walmart comes out and has been very vocal about saying that 92% of their emissions are from their supply chain, it's kind of important for them to look at their supply chain and calculate the emissions from that. We also have a number of companies that have actually reached out to their supply chain, brought a couple of those reports, and we had about 34 companies sign up and say that this was important to them, and so they actually wanted to nominate suppliers to actually fill in the information request. They asked about 2,300 suppliers to fill in the information request, which is pretty detailed. It's about 15, 20 pages long when it's just blank, and there's a lot of detail in it. And of that, about 26% of the companies that were invited actually were able to respond. So just sort of a couple of things. What does this mean in terms of practical impacts? There's an organization called TNS that actually breaks people down into, and this is a consumer spending survey that's done. They break down the world into eco-centrics, respectful stewards, frugal earth mothers, eco-villains. And they have demographics associated with all of these different categories. And they said in an economy like today, where things, people are trying to spend less and trying to be a little more conservative, what does this mean in terms of, are people willing to go out and buy greener? And what they're finding is that the two categories, the respectful stewards and the proud traditionalists, are spending more on greener products, even though the economy is not doing that well. Last couple of thoughts. In terms of the impact, there were some calculations done on what does this mean in terms of if we were actually to have a $35 per ton CO2 tax imposed, what would this mean for fuel, petroleum, gasoline, coal, etc.? What would this mean in terms of the numbers, in terms of what it would, the cost to you? And we also looked at different sectors, and there's more information on this. I won't go through it, but basically the areas that are most impacted are what you would consider the carbon-intensive industries. So primary metals, paper products, all very intensive. Having said that, what are the benefits of participating and reporting on this? And this is where we try and end up the story. Of the 321 companies that responded to the information request under CDP last year, about 10% of the companies were noted for being real leaders in reporting. And so we're able to report and say, here are my emissions, here's what we're doing from a strategy perspective, or actually we don't know, but we've got a process in place and we'll be able to tell you in 2 years. And so these are companies that are getting some recognition for actually disclosing. And this is important to investors who, if they're looking at two similar companies, need to figure out, which one they're going to invest in. This may be a differentiating factor, maybe. We're seeing, and this, sorry about the colors, but what you see here is the number of companies that are reporting risk from climate change is 254 companies in the U.S. versus companies that are seeing opportunities. And in the U.S., you can't see it, but it's 224 companies. So people talk about climate change and risks and opportunities. Almost as many companies see opportunities from climate change in the S&P 500 as see risks. On the Global 500, the numbers are actually the other way around. 324 of the companies, of the 366 companies that responded, see risks, and 326 see opportunities. So more see opportunities than risks. So there were a couple of myths that we sort of walked through when we were talking and voting and sort of polling before. Climate change is not necessarily bad for companies. There are some opportunities, and it's not necessarily just the big companies that are subject to it. We're seeing that it's drilling down to smaller companies. We're seeing that companies are seeing that climate change is good for businesses themselves. And there are a variety of drivers in this whole process, from stakeholders, investors, etc. So I just wanted to finish with one 3-minute video, if I have time, or do I not have time?
We're over about 10 minutes now. So, John, what's your sense?
How long is it?
3 minutes. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is just this is not our words, but let's see.
Consumers have a lot of power.
I can make a change, and I think people need to make a change.
A lot of my choices are based on being green.
Can I, as an individual, make a change? I can make a minute change. However, when I combine with others, when it becomes 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people who will only buy products which are responsibly produced, then yes, we have the economies of scale of the marketplace to make sure that things are done correctly.
Corporations only pay attention when their dollars start to decline.
Is the full life cycle, from start to finish, from where you're getting the product from to how you're marketing the product to where the product ends up and how the product is used.
From choosing raw materials to final packaging, the whole manufacturing cycle should minimize environmental pollution.
I think it starts with awareness. I think every company should be first aware of how its business process is actually affecting the environment.
The big companies has to start with making changes, and then we follow.
It's a consumer sovereignty. It's voting with my dollars, and I will absolutely support the people that are doing what I believe is the right thing.
It's more expensive, but it's worth it.
Products with less packaging is really important to me. In fact, I've not bought an item again because it had too much packaging.
I would change my service according to how friendly it is to the environment, because I think environment is something that affects everyone. It's not only about me.
I have paid more, and I am proud to pay more. I do not make a lot of money, but I feel like I can vote with my dollars.
I am always a little bit skeptical if a company advertises themselves as green, because you never know if they really are or not. So I think the best companies are transparent, that they're doing it for profit, but they are also doing it for the environment.
It needs to actually be taking place transparently so that we can see what it is that they're doing that's making them a green company. It's a fad because it's popular, and it's popular because it's a problem. We have to be really discerning in how we look at a green company. We have to see, is it really green, or is that just a smoke and mirrors thing?
Whether it's a PR move or not, if they're really doing it, then why not back them while they're doing it?
So thank you. Apologies for going over. And if anybody has any questions, I'll take later on. I'll be able to address them. Thanks.